If you enjoy emotional stories from the Old West, make sure to hit like and subscribe to Cowboys of the Old West. Today's story begins with a strange purchase and ends with a truth no one was ready to hear. They say every man has a price. But what happens when what you buy ends up costing more than any gold ever could? It all started with a lonely sheriff, a quiet widow, and a goat. But what seemed like an act of kindness, or maybe madness, would soon become the beginning of a story strong enough to break even the toughest man in the West. The sun had barely risen when Sheriff Carter tied up his horse at the cattle fair fence. The town of Larkstone was slowly waking up, with wagon wheels creaking and vendors shouting through the morning dust. But among the voices, one unexpected sound caught his attention: the bleating of a goat. And then the auctioneer's voice rang out, "1 woman and a goat, $1." The crowd laughed. No one took it seriously. Standing in the dust, a thin woman in a worn-out dress held tight to the goat's rope, saying nothing. Her eyes didn't beg, they said just one thing: she wasn't leaving without a fight. The sheriff watched her for a moment. It wasn't normal. It wasn't right. He knew the West was cruel to those who showed up without a name, without property, and without a man beside them. But there was something about that woman, a quiet strength. Without much thought, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a worn coin, and said, $1. Silence. The auctioneer chuckled, unsure. Sold. The crowd scattered, still laughing. But the sheriff didn't care. He only wanted to know who that woman was, and why, even being sold beside a goat, she still looked at the world like she owed it nothing. Her name was Eloa. She didn't give a last name. Just said her first name and looked the sheriff straight in the eye, like someone who owed no explanations. The goat's name was Olivia. She was old, stubborn, and seemed to understand everything happening around her. As they walked toward the sheriff's office, neither of them said a word. The sheriff opened the door, offered water and a spot in the back room. She nodded in silence. The goat settled into a corner like it already belonged there. That night, Eloa slept curled up on a straw mattress, and the sheriff sat outside under the stars. He had seen everything: thieves, killers, desperate people. But never someone like her. By the next day, the whole town knew. The sheriff bought a woman for $1. They laughed. But no one dared laugh to his face. And no one either had the courage to speak to Eloa. She walked the streets with her head high, the goat trailing behind her like a loyal shadow. Time passed, and her presence stopped causing shock. It caused curiosity. Who was this woman? Where had she come from? And why, even with nothing to her name, did she seem to carry something no one else in that town had any more: dignity? The sheriff tried to understand, but Eloa spoke little. She answered only what was necessary, her voice calm and dry. It was as if each word had to be measured, weighed before it left her lips. But her silence wasn't empty. It was full of stories. There was sadness in her eyes, yes, but there was something else too: strength. One cloudy afternoon, while he fixed the fence behind the station, Eloa showed up holding 2 warm loaves of bread. "Made it with what little I had," she said. He took them awkwardly and, for the first time since she arrived, smiled genuinely. In that simple gesture he understood. She wanted to thank him, not out of charity, but out of respect. Over time, she started helping with everything: cleaning, cooking, feeding the horses. The goat, of course, followed her like a shadow. And the sheriff, without realizing it, began to look forward to her quiet presence at the end of each day, like someone waiting for a comforting silence. But there was still something he didn't understand. Why had such a strong woman been sold for $1? What had driven her to accept it? And more importantly, what pain was she running from? It was on a stormy night that the truth began to surface. Thunder split the sky, and rain ran down the station windows. The sheriff was dozing lightly when he heard a noise from the back room. He got up slowly and found Eloa sitting on the floor, hugging the goat, crying. She tried to compose herself, but he simply sat beside her. He didn't say anything, just waited. And when the silence felt safe, she spoke. She told him her husband had died of fever a year ago. With no children and no family, she was thrown out by his relatives, accused of being a useless mouth. The only thing she managed to take was the goat. She walked for weeks, sleeping in barns, eating what she could find. No one wanted to shelter a widow. They said it brought bad luck. So she stopped asking. She stopped begging. And decided to sell herself, not for money, but for a chance. A place. A new beginning. The sheriff didn't say a word. He just handed her his handkerchief and stayed there until her crying turned to deep sighs. That night, he didn't sleep. Because now he knew what she carried. A kind of pain the Wild West didn't heal. A pain he knew all too well. In the days that followed, the air in Larkstone shifted. People whispered when Eloa walked by. Some still laughed, others just stared. But no one dared get close. The sheriff noticed everything but said nothing. Until one day at the general store, the owner refused to sell bread when he saw her approach. "We don't sell to that kind of woman," he said, loud enough for all to hear. The sheriff, who was nearby, didn't hesitate. He walked up to the counter, picked up 2 loaves, placed the money down, and stared at the man. "Now you did." He took Eloa's arm and they walked out without looking back. The silence in town grew heavier. That night, she said she wanted to leave. "I'm just causing trouble," she said, holding the goat in her arms like a child. But the sheriff was firm. "You're just reminding me what's right. And that's not trouble. That's healing." For the first time, she smiled. Small, timid, but real. That gesture, that phrase, was like opening a window in a house that had been shut for too long. The wind entered. The dust shifted. And for the first time in a long while, the air felt clean. Things seemed to be settling. Eloa had become part of the station's routine. The sheriff had even built a small pen for Olivia, the goat, who now grazed peacefully near the well. But the Wild West has its cruel way of reminding you, the past never stays buried, and in this case, it came on horseback. 3 men arrived in town on a dry, scorching afternoon. Dirty, loud, and armed. They were from the village where Eloa used to live. One of them was the brother of her late husband. They came to reclaim what was theirs, as they put it in the saloon. When they found out where she was, they set up camp outside town, waiting for the right moment to act. The sheriff heard and went to them immediately. He said that as long as she was under his roof, no one would lay a hand on her. The men laughed. "You bought her for $1, Sheriff. Think you can play the hero now?" Carter didn't reply. He just pointed at the badge on his chest and said, "That $1 was the best I ever spent." When he returned, he told Eloa everything. She didn't cry. She didn't shake. She just said, "Then let's see if that $1's really worth it." And that night, they slept like people who knew the running was over. It was time to face whatever came next. In the early hours of the next morning, silence was broken by the pounding of hooves on hard ground and the flicker of lanterns in the dark. The 3 men had returned, this time with 2 more. They were ready to take Eloa by force. The sheriff was already waiting. He stood on the porch, shotgun across his lap, eyes steady, as if he had rehearsed that moment 1,000 times in his mind. Eloa stepped out behind him, a scarf tied in her hair and the goat at her side. There was no fear on her face, only weariness. But there was also resolve. Jonas, the oldest of the intruders, stepped forward. "We just want what's ours. She has to come back." The sheriff took a step forward. "She's not a thing to be taken. And if you try, you won't walk away." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. One of the men raised his hand, ready to draw his weapon. But before he could, the sharp sound of a shotgun being cocked rang out. It wasn't the sheriff. It was Eloa, standing tall, eyes burning in the dim light. "Go ahead. Just one more time." The silence that followed was louder than any gunshot. One by one, the men backed away. They looked at that woman, alone with a goat, defended by a man who barely knew her, and realized there was no weakness there. There was a story, one they would not rewrite. The next day, Larkstone woke up different. Word of the standoff spread quickly. For the first time in years, people looked at the sheriff not with boredom or suspicion, but with respect. And they looked at Eloa with something even rarer in the Old West, admiration. At the general store, the same man who had humiliated her days before offered a bag of flour on the house. At church, The pastor prayed for the strength of women. Even the children began chasing Olivia, the goat, as if she were the town mascot. It was as if the town, little by little, started seeing itself through that woman's story. The sheriff, meanwhile, was quieter than ever. But something inside him had shifted. It wasn't just pride, it was relief. For the first time, he felt he'd done more than uphold the law. He had protected someone no one else would. And deep down he knew it was her who had saved him. That night, they sat together on the porch. Eloa said little. She simply whispered, "Thank you for seeing me." The sheriff, his throat tight, replied, "You're the one who taught me how to look." And then they stayed there, in the comforting silence of those who no longer need to run. A week later, while organizing old paperwork at the station, the sheriff came across a forgotten letter inside a locked drawer. It was addressed to him, in the handwriting of his late wife. Dated 2 days before her death. He stood still for long moments before finding the courage to open it. The letter was short, but each word pierced through him. In it, his wife wrote that she knew her time was coming, but she didn't want him to die with her. That when love came knocking again, he shouldn't shut the door out of fear or guilt. If it's a tired soul, take care of it. And if it's a lonely woman, listen. He read those words as if her voice were right there in his ear. He cried. For the first time in years, he truly cried. Not for Eloa. Not for himself. But for everything lost along the way. For all he'd stopped himself from feeling. When he folded the letter, he walked to the window. Outside, Eloa was feeding the goat, laughing at something only she and the animal seemed to understand. And he knew. It was time to stop surviving and start living again. That night, he left the letter on Eloa's table. Said nothing. And went to sleep. For the first time, he dreamed without nightmares. The next morning, Eloa found the letter beside the coffee mug. She read it slowly, as if afraid of waking old ghosts. When she finished, she stayed silent for a long time. That woman, so often rejected, now held in her hands a piece of the story of a man no one dared to reach. She didn't go to him that day, nor the next. She went on with her routine, feeding the goat, sweeping the station floor, speaking little. But something had changed in the way she looked at Carter. It wasn't doubt. It was waiting. As if she knew some wounds need air before they can heal. Only days later, during a simple dinner, she asked, "You bought me for $1. Still have the receipt?" He blinked, surprised. "Of course not." And she smiled lighter than ever. "Good. Because I prefer things that can't be priced." He didn't answer. He simply placed his hand over hers on the table. And for the first time, she didn't pull away. They stayed there, hands joined, as if that gesture were a contract. Not of ownership, but of choice, of care, of belonging, and maybe of love. Spring's arrival brought more than flowers to Larkstone. It brought color to the windows, laughter to the streets, and the smell of fresh bread in the mornings. But it also brought something new that quickly spread. The sheriff was fixing up the town's old schoolhouse. "For when the kids come back," he said, even though there were no kids around yet. Eloa started helping with reading lessons in the evenings. Slowly, women from nearby farms began to show up, some bringing children, others just listening. For the first time, she wasn't just a widow. She was a voice, a guide. And Olivia the goat? She became the school's unofficial mascot. One evening, while cleaning the newly painted classroom, Carter said quietly, "You realize you built a whole new town without ever leaving this one?" Eloa smiled, looking at the walls covered in children's drawings. "Sometimes, we just need a place that lets us bloom." It was true. The Old West was usually harsh and unforgiving. But on that small patch of land, in a forgotten town, 2 broken souls came together and rebuilt a community. Not with guns or laws, but with empathy, courage, and the choice to begin again. Years went by. The story of the widow and the goat became legend in Larkstone. They said the quietest sheriff in the West was broken by a smile and a story. That a woman with no gun or horse had changed the soul of a man with a heart made of iron. The goat passed away from old age, surrounded by children who considered her a friend. Eloa started signing her name as Carter, not because of paper, but out of pride. And Carter, well, he was never the same again. He traded his shotgun for books, his strictness for listening, and his fear for tenderness. They never said, "I love you," out loud. In the Old West, too many words were suspicious. But anyone who saw them together knew there was love. A love with no rush, no pressure, no price. A love that began with a purchase and became freedom. And what about you? Have you ever thought that sometimes what seems small, like a dollar or a goat, can change a whole life? That stories can heal, and meetings can start everything over again? If this story touched your heart, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us, what encounter changed your life?